the human body is not, never was, and never will be designed to withstand an impact from an object driven by a drunk moving at that speed. We're talking about events that become nearly physically impossible to survive and leave people completely torn up. They're people with families behind them that will never be the same. The hardest part of being the chief in vehicular crimes was the family meetings. They were regular, also weekly.
Behind my badge is a heart like yours. I bleed, I think, I love, and yes, I can be killed. And although I am but one man, I have thousands of brothers and sisters who are the same as me. We stand watch together, a thin blue line, protecting the prey from the predators, the good from the bad. We are the police.
Urgent X-39 is in pursuit of a code 37 vehicle west.
What is up, guys? My name is Ramon Gutierrez, and welcome to the first episode of the 623 Show. Today, we are going to be talking about something that impacts all of us, and that is drunk driving. We're going to be talking about the impact that it has on the community, the impact that it has on the families, and what we can do to create change. So today, I have with me an expert in the field. I have Michael Hanover, a prosecutor here in Houston, Texas, at our DA's office. So, Michael, go ahead, introduce yourself, and tell everyone a little bit about what you do.
Great. So my name is Michael Hanover. I am a prosecutor and have been for coming up on 8 years at the DA's office. During the course of that time, I've served as the chief of vehicular crimes at our office. And what that entails is I supervised 6 felony prosecutors who were assigned the totality of our intoxication manslaughter cases in Harris County. Obviously, it's a big county. We're talking about hundreds of cases. Behind every single one of those cases is a deceased victim that has lost their life to an intoxicated driver. Additionally, I was a trainer on what we call our call-out team. Our office responds to every roadway fatality where the presumed at-fault driver has survived. So if law enforcement arrives at the scene and based on their initial investigation, they've determined that who they believe to be the at-fault driver has survived, we go out. And so as the trainer, because I was rotating through multiple other felony prosecutors who I was teaching, I responded to these fatality scenes, many, maybe even a majority of which involved an intoxicated driver having taken somebody's life, and I was responding weekly for the period of about a year. And so that's my background in the law as it pertains to this issue.
I got you. And you were originally assigned to my dad's case, actually. For those of y'all that do not know, in 2022, on January 24th, 2022, I lost my dad to a drunk driver. He was a police officer for the Harris County Sheriff's Office, and he was working an extra job where he was escorting an oversized load. And early into the morning of the 24th, around I think 12:30 a.m., he was struck by an impaired driver who had over 2,000 feet of distance to be able to see him and to be able to make an adjustment and to get out of the way. So I'm speaking from the perspective of a family who has been personally impacted by this, and we wanted to bring Michael on here to help speak from the prosecutor side so that we can really dive into that.
You know, I think there are some details of your dad's case that also are a really good place to jump from into this. And you alluded to one of them, which was the idea that the line of sight issue of just how much time she had to see your dad. I think another one that will always stand out to me from your dad's case is what his mission was in that moment, being off of his bike and in the moving lane, almost like he's doing the job of, he's an expert out on the road that night. He's preventing an intoxicated driver, just like the one that hit him, from slingshotting down that exit ramp into an intersection where he knows there are multiple pedestrians at work. And for it to end the way that it did, I think speaks as much as any one incident can to the dangers of intoxicated driving. The exact thing that he was trying to save other people from in that moment is what takes his life. And that's the terror of intoxicated drivers right there in one moment.
Yeah, I agree, and I wanted to dive in a little bit more into how bad it really is, because I don't think people even realize how bad it is, especially here in Texas. So could you give us a little bit of an insight into how bad it is nationally and also how bad it is here in Texas?
I mean, you can look at the numbers, and you got it's between 2014 and 2023, you have 14,389 lives taken in DUI-related incidents in Texas. In 2023 alone, you have 1,138 lives lost across the state to intoxicated driving-related incidents. Big numbers, lots of people. To make those numbers real, you have to recognize that every single one of those people, 14,000 people in between 2014 and 2023, I think you could pack a stadium with that.
Then imagine the families.
Exactly. We are talking about every one of these people has a mom and a dad. They may have children, they have brothers and sisters. You know better than anybody what it's like when your loved one doesn't come home. So behind every one of those numbers is a family, and the heartache from that, as you know, lasts forever. These people are left totally broken. And then there's a physics component to this, which is the vehicles that we're talking about in a fatal crash are moving between speeds of, say, 25 and upwards of 100 miles an hour. Each of these cars weighs maybe 3,000 to 5,000 pounds on the low end. The human body is not, never was, and never will be designed to withstand an impact from an object driven by a drunk moving at that speed. And so we're not talking about gunshot wounds that poke holes that may or may not be survivable. We're talking about events that become nearly physically impossible to survive and leave people completely torn up. And these are not just people, they're people with families behind them that will never be the same.
And something that, again, we're on the road with these people every single day. Every time you commute to work, every time you come home, you're putting yourself at risk because there's so many, you have no idea what the car next to you, the state of that driver is. And like you said, with the numbers and how bad they are, it happens a lot more than people think. And I'm sure anybody listening to this podcast knows at least somebody who's been affected by drunk driving or has had a major crash on the road. And I know, like you said, from a family's perspective who has been through this, how devastating it is to get that call and to realize that your loved one isn't coming home. And we had to completely rebuild our lives. It took me multiple years to get back on track, and it was very, very difficult. And so can you speak from the prosecutor side what you've kind of seen it do to these families? Because you've had to be in the background handling all the business while the families are rebuilding. So can you give us a little bit into an insight into the impact that it's had, that you've seen?
Yeah. I mean, far and away, the hardest part of being the chief in vehicular crimes was the family meetings. They were regular, also weekly. Families coming in to talk about the state of the evidence in their loved one's case, all the while knowing that there's nothing that I can do in the courtroom or at the DA's office to bring their loved one back. They're hanging on to the idea that someone that I love has been killed and things are out of balance. And until some measure of justice is restored, they're upside down. And so the tears and the agony I tried to set as many of my meetings as I could on Fridays, because some of them were so hard that they made it hard for me to go home and finish my day off in a normal way and then come back to work the next morning. I almost needed a weekend to recover from the emotional strain. And of course, I'm getting secondary emotional baggage from this. The pain is theirs. Even just what of it they will share with me is devastating enough to make me want to use my weekend to get back to normal myself.
Yeah, so. and I'm glad that you brought up justice, because that's exactly why we're here. And luckily, my family, you guys at the DA's office, my dad's team, his coworkers did a phenomenal job at making sure that we had enough evidence to get that justice. But there's so many cases that evidence just isn't there. And what we're going to be talking about today is a loophole that is in our current justice system that allows a lot of these offenders to get away with the crime that they've committed. And so, could you speak a little bit about the bill HB 2984? It's actually named after my dad. It's named the Sergeant Ramon Gutierrez bill. Can you explain what it is and a little bit of why it's needed?
Yes, absolutely. So what the bill is it creates a rebuttable presumption that you were intoxicated at the time you were operating your motor vehicle if a specimen of your blood or breath is taken at some time after the crash or after the traffic stop that shows you were at a .08 or higher. The way that the law is currently written defines intoxication in 3 different ways. Either a loss of the normal use of your mental faculties, a loss of the normal use of your physical faculties, both of those due to some introduction of a substance into your system, or a .08 or higher. Well, the thing is, those definitions provide for the time of the driving event. And in all cases, when law enforcement is able to lawfully secure a specimen that gives a concrete number for somebody's blood alcohol content, it's after the fact. All law enforcement is reactive, right? We don't have eyes on the back of our head. This is not Minority Report where we get a printout in the morning of everybody. This is a list of everybody who's going to drive drunk today, and this is where they're going to do it. So we are reacting on the back end and piecing together an investigation after something's already happened. The reason why a rebuttable presumption of intoxication at the time of driving based on a specimen taken later on is necessary is to cut off this argument that we deal with in the courtroom time after time, which is the rising BAC argument. And I can sort of lay out an example if that's helpful. Yeah. So the way that this goes is somebody's arrested for DWI, intoxication, manslaughter, whatever it may be, and let's say a specimen of their blood or breath comes back at a .14. The state took probably 3 to 5 hours to obtain that specimen from the time of the stop or the crash. And so when we get into the courtroom, the argument that we hear is, well, yeah, I was at .14 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours after the crash, but I drank a whole bunch of alcohol right before I got behind the wheel. It hadn't settled in and absorbed into my system at the time of the crash. It was the whole time that the police were investigating, I was becoming more and more intoxicated, and I reached a .14 at some point down the line. May sound ridiculous, but the way that the law is currently set up, I, as the prosecutor, have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that that's not the case. And all the evidence and information that I need in order to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that that's not the case is completely in the hands of the defendant or inside the defendant's body. As the prosecutor, I don't know whether the pyloric valve in your stomach was open or closed at the time that you got behind the wheel or at the time that you were drinking. You can tell me, or you could tell a police officer that, well, I had 2 tacos for an afternoon snack at 3 p.m. and we can try to predict based off of that information what state that valve was in your stomach and how quickly you would have absorbed alcohol. But then the issue that we're dealing with is the credibility of what our suspect or defendant tells us about what they ate, when, how much they drank, and when. And so my argument would be that because the evidence to rebut the rising BAC argument is completely in the hands of the defendant, that the law should be on par with that. And if I can show a test and a specimen that puts you above a .08, then there needs to be a rebuttable presumption that you were in fact intoxicated at the time of driving.
And so when we were at the Capitol, one of the problems that we kept running into is, one, it kind of seems like common sense, right? And some people don't even know why this law is necessary. They just kind of assume that that's how it works at the beginning, right? And then two, people had a little bit of a hard time understanding the technicality of the bill. Even though it is kind of straightforward, there are a lot of technical terms and a lot of things that can kind of confuse people. So I just want to make sure that I have it down and that the audience has it down. So I'm going to kind of reiterate it back to you, and you just make sure that I'm on the right track. So what you're saying basically is, right now, when someone gets arrested and they are found to be intoxicated, typically it takes anywhere from 2 to 3 hours, like you said, to actually find that, to get somebody out there who can give the test and who can confirm that. And so what is happening is the defense is arguing that sometime between when they crashed, when they got pulled over, they're consuming alcohol, and that is the reason that they are testing at above a .08.
It's worse than that. It's even scarier than that for all of us that drive. The argument that they're using to tear down righteous intox manslaughter and DWI cases is not even that they somehow had alcohol in the time that they were in police custody. That's even more ridiculous. It doesn't happen. Never seen it happen. It's that they drank, say, multiple drinks 20 minutes before they got behind the wheel, and that alcohol that they drank before they ever knew they were going to be stopped during a crash hadn't hit them yet when they were stopped or when they crashed, and soaked into their system while they were in police custody prior to taking their breath or blood.
Okay, got you. And so one of the other concerns that we had was that it was making it too easy on the defense, right? It basically, what this is doing is this is shifting the burden onto the defendant to prove that they were not intoxicated at that time, and that some of the people had a problem with that interfering with our constitutional rights. And so can you explain, just so where the average person can understand, why this does not infringe on our constitutional rights, and that we actually have other examples in our rights that are in the law that have this rebuttable presumption? So
so the history of rebuttable presumptions, I mean, there's nothing new about a proposal like this. And we can talk about some of the places that it's already in the penal code in other areas of law. A couple come to mind for me. But going all the way back to the 1940s and early, federal firearms law, there were presumptions in that law, and suspects arrested for those crimes made the constitutional challenge of the rebuttable presumption, took it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and we have a pretty simple test to apply to a rebuttable presumption. And that was the case of Tott v. U.S. back in the 1940s. And what is required for a rebuttable presumption to be constitutional is that it has to pass what's called a rational connection test. There needs to be an empirical, probative connection between the fact that is going to be presumed and the basic fact that has to be proven to earn said presumption. And so applying that to HB 2984, basically, for this to be constitutional, you got to show that the science supports that somebody who's a .08 or higher at the time of a test was also a .08 at the time of driving. And it overwhelmingly does. I'm not a forensic toxicologist, but I work with them all the time, and There are forensic toxicologists that I know have been consulted and are working on this bill as well. And the empirical connection is right here. In all likelihood, if you have to wait 3 to 5 hours to have the blood drawn or to blow into the intoxilizer, what's happening inside of your body for a majority of that time is what's called elimination. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is you are going down. By the time that blood or breath comes out of you, you have eliminated alcohol for a significant period of time. Mm-hmm. Of course, it's different in every case, based on the person, based on how long it takes to get to the test. But the reality here is that the people who are testing above a 0.08, 3, 4, 5 more hours later were higher at the time of driving. It's a black box. The information that tells us the concrete, perfect answer lies in the defendant's hand. And that's the other part of what the Supreme Court said in the Todd case, was there's a question of comparative convenience, is how the courts put it. All that means is it's a fancy term to say a rebuttable presumption is most likely to be appropriate constitutionally in situations where the defense side of the case comparatively has the convenience of access to the evidence on the issue. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. The defendant is the one who knows what and how much they drank, maybe in the privacy of their own home. We don't want to live in a world where I, as the government, can have eyes on you inside of your house. Mm-hmm. That's not how it works. This is the United States of America. Mm-hmm. But the flip side of that is the comparative convenience of who has access to the evidence on what you drank when you last ate is you. Mm-hmm. And so if you're going to get out on the road and put yourself in a position where 3 to 5 hours after you crash or get stopped, you're still above a 0.08, it makes sense and it is constitutional that there ought to be a rebuttable presumption that you then have to deal with.
Okay, so basically people who see this law and they think that this is just an easy way for us to get more convictions, they when they see this law, some people interpret it as if you have above a 0.08, no matter what, for sure, case closed, and that's it. So it basically is making it very, very easy for us to prosecute people who are accused of drunk driving. But like you said, that's clearly not the case.
Oh, and in fact, I mean that would be what you would legally call foreclosure. Is I established this one thing and case closed, case is over. Mm-hmm. Laws like that have been found to be unconstitutional. That's not what this is. Mm-hmm. The way that this works mechanically in the courtroom is like this. So the first thing that I would have to do as the prosecutor is, number one, show that I lawfully obtained a specimen. Mm-hmm. Nothing changes about the fact that I've still got to get a search warrant or your consent to get a hold of that specimen to even get the number in the first place. Okay. If I have an admissible, lawful specimen, the first gatekeeper, so to speak, on this is the judge. Mm-hmm. If the instrument that took the specimen is shown to be unreliable, or I can't prove up its reliability, and my test is basically trash, then the judge can say, you don't even get close to establishing beyond a reasonable doubt that there was a lawful 0.08 at any period of time. I'm not even going to let the jury hear about the rebuttable presumption. Mm-hmm. But if, on the other hand, I am able to show a reliable analysis at 0.08 or higher at some point down the line, well, then the issue goes to the jury. And the jury is instructed upon the closure of the evidence that if they find beyond a reasonable doubt that this person was a 0.08 or higher after the time of driving, then they are to presume that they were intoxicated at the time of driving in the absence of other evidence. Mm-hmm. And the mechanics of that and how this works is already in the penal code. It's in section 2.05. 2.05 tells judges who administer jury trials how to deal with rebuttable presumptions, whether it's in a DWI case or in a theft case or a fraudulent possession of identifying information case. It tells the judge what the procedure is to follow, and the bottom line is, if the evidence that gives rise to the presumption isn't credible, the judge can throw it out. Jury never hears about it. If it is credible, it goes to the jury, and the jury still, just like they do now, has the final say on the element of the offense, which is intoxication.
Okay. And the next question that we had was that, again, the next question that we had was that the prosecution, again, was kind of trying to find an easy way out. But the main thing that I don't think people understand is how inefficient the retrograde extrapolation is. So could you explain a little bit about that process, like what it is, what exactly it is, and why it's so unreliable for you guys to rely on?
Yeah, so I'm not a toxicologist. I don't pretend to be one. But having used and prepared for trials that involve this type of evidence, I do have a knowledge base on it. And so all retrograde extrapolation is about is taking a blood alcohol content at the time of the test and rendering a scientific opinion on what it would have been at some time prior. This is the thing. Forensic scientists and prosecutors are very conservative about rendering a scientific opinion that could take away somebody's liberty. We police ourselves, both as prosecutors and the forensic science community. There must be no bias, there must be no desired result, and so we have to be very, very careful in doing something like this because of what's at stake for the defendant. That being said, you need scientific data in order to perform a retrograde extrapolation. You need to know the time of driving. You need to know the time that's expired since the time of driving. You need to know when the person last ate, and you need to know when they last drank, what they last drank, and then you need some details about their biology, size, weight, things like that. The whole issue with retrograde extrapolation is that unless the defendant tells us, which they're not required to do under the Fifth Amendment, they're not required to incriminate themselves, unless they tell us, we don't have those data points. And so we say, as prosecutors and forensic scientists say, without that information, we're not gonna take what would be a guess with missing variables. That's not fair to the defendant for us to make assumptions about those details. So if we don't know the information, we don't put on extrapolation testimony, and what then happens is the jury's told under the current law, you've got to go back in the jury room and somehow figure out how to get from a test that was taken at some time after a crash or a stop and decide for yourselves whether you think they were at a .08 at the time of driving. And we're telling juries to look for evidence and testimony that we can't give, and we can't give it because we're trying to be as fair as possible to the people who are accused.
One of the things that I heard too was that this also makes our system a lot more inefficient too, because the toxicologists are doing all these calculations and spending all this time and showing up to court and having to set time away from their work week. And so they can't even work on all the cases that their massive caseload that they already have and they're already behind on, and it just continues to contribute to why our justice system is so inefficient.
I think that's absolutely true. Again, I'm not in that workflow with the toxicologist, so I don't know exactly how cumbersome it is to attempt or to be WI offenders. And what I mean by that is the cases where we suffer most from the issues in the current state of the law are our most serious crashes. And the explanation for that is this. In your regular run-of-the-mill traffic stop DWI case, nobody's injured in all likelihood. And so what you have is a suspect who's on scene, interacting with a police officer, and pretty reliably able to be put through a battery of standardized field sobriety tests. If I, as the prosecutor, have the horizontal gaze nystagmus test, and I've got video of you from multiple angles performing the one-leg stand and the walk and turn, I have something pretty concrete I can give to the jury where I can say, look, they were at this number down our timeline. And when you're asking yourself as the jury the question of how do I know this guy was that intoxicated at the time that he was driving, I can point to that video and I can say, well, look at the involuntary jerking in his eyes. And you heard scientific testimony about how alcohol causes that. Look at him trying to stand on one leg and perform the one leg stand. Look at him totally unable to follow instructions and do the walk and turn. That data is going to be really close to the time of driving. However, in a fatality case, law enforcement is going to prioritize medical care for everybody involved. And that's how it should be, right? That we're going to seek to save lives above all else. But what happens is our suspect, who was going 80 miles an hour, intoxicated on alcohol, the wrong way, and obliterated an entire family of people, probably got banged up in the process and they went to the hospital. And because there's doctors hovering over them, or because they're unconscious, or because they're in surgery, we don't get our standardized field sobriety tests anymore. What data point is left for us to tie a BAC back to the time of driving? And so those cases are oftentimes when I, as the prosecutor, have to bring the family in and say, I can't prove it under the way the law is currently written. And I leave those meetings thinking, how wrong is that? That these people, these are victims that did absolutely nothing to ask to become involved in the criminal justice system. They are literally roadway motorists who were going to the grocery store or whatever. They're the most innocent victims you can imagine. And how wrong is that? That the law is telling the jury in their loved one's case to look for something that may just not exist because we were so dedicated to saving the life of the suspect who killed their family. It's not how it should be.
And I can't even imagine how my family would have felt if we didn't get justice, and if a detail like this in the law prevented us from getting that. I can't even imagine. I think one of the only reasons we've been able to rebuild is because we did get justice on our case, and we did have such an amazing team supporting us. But like you said, not everybody gets that, and this is affecting, like you said, our most violent offenders on this. And so, can you speak to, have you seen a family that has been put in that situation where they don't get justice and where this comes into play? Can you explain the impact that has on them, and also how you feel as a prosecutor knowing that you couldn't get your job done because of this loophole in the system?
A lot of it goes back to plea bargaining, and part of my responsibility as a prosecutor is to recognize this issue coming from far enough away that nobody's blindsided by it. And so at that point, the family comes in and we have a meeting, and I tell them what my assessment is of what our risks are at a jury trial. And then we work together to decide how much risk we're willing to take on. I don't do anything without the input of the family, because if we're not doing this for them, how much does it really matter? And so a lot of it comes into play with, this family's being told that we're going to have this issue at trial of tying BAC at the time of the test back to the time of driving. Jury's going to be looking for that evidence. They may not be provided much evidence on that point, and so there is a major risk of a complete not guilty. And so what you see happen is people who are charged in fatality cases can walk away with probation in situations where there's an inconsistency between what happened and what the evidence shows about what they did and the impact on the family and that sentence. It just doesn't sit right. And you asked how that feels to me. I mean, that's devastating. That in some regards, that it leaves a worse feeling than an acquittal at trial, because you feel lame. You feel like you rolled over. And of course, that's not done without counseling the family through it. And in all my cases, thankfully, where that happened, I was in lockstep with the family. They understood that it was what we needed to do and why, and we went through that process together, and I even had their support on the back end. But of course, it doesn't always go that way, and it's professionally heartbreaking too.
And so right now, our bill HB 2984 it just passed the first step. I believe it's in the early stages of getting passed. And so what we wanted to do with this podcast is we wanted to get the awareness out, and as far as how bad drunk driving is, the impact that it has on our families, and this is something that we are currently trying to implement to help those families that do suffer get justice. And so what can people from our community do to help get this bill passed, and also to help make sure that we're preventing drunk driving?
As far as the passage of the bill, of course, its future is in the hands of our elected officials, who will have to vote on it and make a decision about whether or not it becomes part of the penal code. And so we know what to do. Your voice as a member of the community is through your vote, but it's more than that. It's our representatives in the House and in the Senate, our Texas representatives, are accessible to us. And so it's phone calls, it's outreach, but we've got to reach a place in Harris County and in the rest of the counties in this state where enough becomes enough. I think a lot of people don't really take the time to understand and to think about the absolute carnage that intoxicated drivers are causing. To do that, to cause physical damage to somebody else's loved one on that level, is unforgivable, it's heinous, and we've got to get to a place where we say enough is enough, and we need to reverse the course and bring the numbers down, because like we started off talking about, behind every number is a family. And so that's what I would say. We have a say in who our elected officials are and what information they have and what communication they get from their constituents, and so I think reach out.
Yeah, I would agree. And this is the most preventable case, like the most preventable violent offense that could ever happen. And it's so easy with all the opportunities that we have. We have Uber, we have Lyft, you have friends. Like it's easier now than ever to avoid drunk driving. And so I'm very honored to be a part of this process, and for my family to contribute in some way to making our roads safer. And our goal is just to make sure that as few families as possible go through what we have been through. And so I want to thank you so much for being here, for supporting our family, for working on our case, and for helping us continue to make an impact. And we truly believe that this is just the beginning. We have a lot of plans for this platform. But again, I just really want to thank you for being a part of this, and we're going to make a big impact together. So
Awesome. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.